Well, let's get started, and hopefully the rest of the crowd outside makes its way in to listen to us. So to get started, I'm going to introduce the moderator of the next panel, Sarah Kaufman, who's the Associate Director for Technology at our neighbors, the NYU Rudin Center, right across the river at the Wagner School. And Sarah is going to introduce our panelists and lead the discussion.
Thanks, Trudy, and thanks everyone for being here. Welcome to the panel, Connected and Autonomous Vehicles and the Future of Ride-Hailing and Shared Rides. We are going to have a great panel. It'll be worth staying until the end of the day. I'm going to call up our panelists: Dawn Miller, Chief of Staff and Chief Technology Officer at the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission; Henry Greenidge, Manager for Government Affairs and Community Relations at Cruise Automation; and Veronica Vanterpool, Deputy Director of the Vision Zero Network. So thanks to all of you for coming. This is an especially important panel because when we talk about the future of automated mobility, we usually assume that car ownership will be dead at that point, and vehicles will be shared and rides will be shared. And at the very least, we will be kind of summoning cars to us rather than getting in the cars and driving somewhere. So it's a really important discussion, and so before we kick off, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and what work they're doing in relation to today's discussion.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the panel. So as Sarah said, my name is Dawn Miller. I'm the Chief of Staff and CTO at New York City's Taxi and Limousine Commission, which is the city agency charged with overseeing the taxi and for-hire industry. Our mission is to promote safety, consumer protection, and access for all in New York City, and we have a really broad scope. Right now, we license 190,000 drivers in New York City, and we're responsible for 130,000 vehicles and a wide variety of businesses ranging from a taxi garage to a mom and pop dial-a car service to global companies like Uber and Lyft. And a lot of the work we've been doing recently surrounding AVs has been in partnership with other city agencies such as the Department of Transportation, looking and lobbying surrounding federal legislation to make sure that the right powers are retained in local governments. There's a lot of regulation of autonomous vehicles that should happen at the federal level, but there are certain things that are very important to be retained locally, and so we've been engaged in those discussions. And for TLC's part specifically, I think the biggest thing we've been doing kind of in preparation of autonomous vehicles is getting the data from the companies we regulate so that the city and other stakeholders can have a sense of how many vehicles are out there on the road, where they're going, how fast are they going, what sort of congestion are they causing, because having data about what's going on in these vehicles is important for sure to be able to address some of the potential challenges surrounding autonomous vehicles and hopefully take advantage of some of the opportunities they present.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Henry Greenidge, and I handle government relations and community relations for Cruise Automation, also known as GM Cruise. And so, for those who don't know, Cruise is a driverless car company. We are headquartered in San Francisco. We first started in 2013. 2016 was the year in which we entered into a groundbreaking partnership with General Motors. We are slightly different from GM, though. GM has a mission of selling cars, whereas Cruise, we have a mission of selling rides, driverless rides. So what we've said, and publicly, is that by 2019, we will be ready to launch a rideshare service, a driverless rideshare service in a major urban market. What I help to do is to open up regulatory environments and break down some of those barriers so that we're able to do that. My role focuses on government relations, but it sort of teeters the lines on public affairs as well. I deal with a multitude of stakeholders at the city and state level in multiple states along the East Coast.
Hey everybody, I am Veronica Vanterpool, Deputy Director of Vision Zero Network. It's a new role for me, which I've been in about 2 months. Many of you know my role as a New York MTA board member, and prior to that I used to run an advocacy organization based in New York City called Tri-State Transportation Campaign. Tri-State is one of the existing transportation advocacy groups in the Tri-State region that actually worked with New York City to help implement Vision Zero back in 2014. It was an initiative brought by one of our partner organizations, Transportation Alternatives, but they worked very closely with the advocacy community at large in order to get Vision Zero implemented in New York City. So it's not a stretch for me to now join this national network. And it's a very exciting time, and admittedly, the Vision Zero Network, like many advocacy organizations, particularly in the transportation and transit and public space arena, have been thinking very creatively about and excitedly about this new technology and ride-sharing economy and CAVs. And as I was alluding to, admittedly, we are at this very nascent discussion level as well, much like everyone else in this room and the industry at large, where we understand the potential, we're excited about the potential, but we want to make sure that we are working to create and ensure that this technology is indeed delivering some of the safety benefits that I know the Vision Zero Network is very interested in. Every single year, nearly 40,000 people lose their lives in traffic fatalities in the United States. It is the highest of any developed country in this world. So, from the perspective of Vision Zero Network, we're excited about the promise of safety, but we want to ensure that, of course, that there's accountability. We want to ensure that there's regulation, that there's metrics that we can harness, and that we are no longer trapped in this cycle of designing our cities around the automobile just because there's new technology.
Thank you. We've a very impressive panel today. So I wanted to start with talking about something that is kind of widely assumed about driverless cars, which is that they will fill this role of serving where there are transit deserts or underserved areas in terms of transit. And that's already true now with green taxis and ride-hailing companies. Lyft recently revealed numbers that about 40% of their trips in New York City are in the outer boroughs. So we're seeing a lot of activity in underserved transit areas. And Henry, how do you see that changing when these services like Lyft are autonomous? Will it affect people's relationship to transit in underserved areas? What is your take?
Sure, and so I'm speaking from the perspective of Cruise. The impact of transit is something that we think about, it's something that we work on every day. From our perspective, what we're really trying to do is come in different cities, states, localities, and work with government stakeholders to determine what transportation challenges are out there. And then we can talk about how AV can help complement or supplement transit services. So what's important to understand about Cruise is we are in the design phase. We are currently testing in Arizona, Detroit, and San Francisco. We haven't launched a commercial product. But one of the things we're doing now is we're talking with stakeholders to understand what some of those needs could be. So if we're thinking about going to X city, we'll talk with those stakeholders there to figure out how AV can help with some of those transportation challenges. Overall, I think many of you are familiar with some of the benefits that are out there. For us, it's the fact that our fleet is 100% green. It's the fact that we work for a company, GM, whose mantra is zero emissions, zero congestion, and zero crashes. And so that's something that we look to deploy our technology with. The main point that you can sort of take away from this is that Cruise and other companies as well, before they go into different markets, they have to understand how they can help that market. And one of the things that we're trying not to do is hurt transit. We've seen the numbers out there. We have folks who work in our policy department who come from different transit agencies. And to be honest with you, it is unknown. I'm not going to sit here and say that, Cruise will absolutely have no negative impact on transit. But what I am saying is we are a company that is coming, having these conversations and looking how we can mitigate impacts while also building a successful commercial business.
So, coming from the transit advocacy community, we have been in this interesting situation for a little more than a decade. The transit advocacy community has largely been supportive of the taxi industry. We always saw taxis as an extension of the transit system in a way. It made it possible for New Yorkers and visitors and residents and workers to not own a vehicle and still get around in areas that are transit deserts. But now we're in a situation where there's been some data. In fact, MTA a few months ago did its own analysis and showed a direct correlation in transit deserts and in certain communities that are not transit deserts but have had inferior transit service, that the drop in ridership actually correlates with a rise in ride sharing. So while I don't think a lot of these companies are coming in saying, we want to siphon these riders off, it has been an unintended consequences, and maybe for some companies, a very intended consequence. So I think what we're seeing is also a result of our failing transit system, right? If we had better transit service, this dynamic wouldn't be as tense and it wouldn't be as stark. So clearly, we have to make these improvements on the transit side. Our subway and bus network need a significant amount of improvement. But as we start talking about the short, medium, and long term, we all know that these are solutions in every sector that require short, medium, and long term approach and vision.
Dawn, I'd like to give you a minute to provide a response from the Taxi and Limousine Commission perspective. What regulations do you see as necessary? What regulations might TLC put in place for autonomous rideshare vehicles?
Sure, and just kind of jumping in on this interesting conversation, it is, I think our thinking as well is kind of evolving around how complementary versus competitive taxis and ride-hailing companies are with transit, and our agency seeks to support these industries, but we serve the people of New York and want to optimize their ability to get around. And so sometimes, I get thinking about what's a good trip to occur in a ride-hailing vehicle because there wasn't a good transit option, and what's a bad trip where there was a transit option, but for some reason that wasn't happening. So I think it's kind of complicated, looking at what times of days and what trips are happening, what types of trips are happening, and where they're going to know where it's bad substitution that's maybe driven by transit needing to improve, or whether it's a good substitution because that trip had taken place on transit, but it was extremely onerous for the person to do it. But more broadly, with respect to what TLC regulations might need to change, I love this question. It's something I think those of us at the agency have kind of nerded out thinking through. I think a lot of our book of rules would disappear because some of that is things we do about screening human drivers to make sure that human driver who's picking you up doesn't have a serious criminal background or hasn't gotten a ton of speeding tickets and things like that. So a lot of that human-centric screening would go away. But on the flip side, there's a lot of there's new types of issues that would be introduced. One is if you are sharing rides with strangers. Even in New York, we've gotten used to doing that. About 20% of trips in the big apps are shared. Some of us are skeptical New Yorkers to get on board, but we are. But right now there's a human driver who's there a little bit as a mediator. So what occurs when there are disputes or negative interactions between passengers who don't know anyone and there isn't any sort of third party or sort of authority figure there to help manage that situation. So we may need to figure out between the regulator and the companies that provide the services, how do you address those types of situations to make sure you feel safe getting in the car, you may feel safe putting your teenager in the car or sending one to pick your relative up at the airport. We'll also have to monitor for discrimination. Some discrimination is by humans, and that's a problem with some of our drivers. But discrimination can also occur through algorithm or through business decisions that the companies make. And if autonomous vehicles become a necessary part of the transportation network, almost like a utility, we're being excluded from them, would really impact your ability to get around, we need to make sure that companies aren't discriminating on them. And then further than that, we have to look at equity. How do we make sure that there are access for all communities if this is something that is a real serious part of the transportation network? I think management will be a huge thing governments need to think about, including DLC, even before autonomous vehicles. With the tremendous growth in the universe of vehicles that we regulate, the city's city council has recently taken action to limit the number of ride-hailing vehicles in the city while we figure out a long-term solution. So I think the importance of a smart congestion management regulation only increases as autonomous vehicles are introduced into the system. I could go on, but I'll leave it there.
That's certainly a long list of considerations that the TLC has in front of them. I want to go back to the topic of safety that you touched on and bring it around to the pedestrian side. Veronica, you focus on Vision Zero, which of course is focused on reducing deaths and injuries to pedestrians and cyclists and anybody else on the streets of the city and others. In what ways do you see connected and autonomous vehicles affecting Vision Zero goals and policies?
Driver error is a factor in 94% of traffic fatalities. And we talked already about there being nearly 40,000 traffic fatalities every year in the US. 6,000 of those traffic fatalities are pedestrians. So when we think about this technology and how it can optimize our street space, how it can detect safety issues in the onset, we are excited about the possibilities for safety of all road users. And Sarah is right to point out that the Vision Zero Network and many of us in this space, in this advocacy space, are looking at pedestrians and cyclists because they tend to be our most vulnerable street users. But Vision Zero Network is really about making sure all road users are able to travel the road safely, and that includes people in cars. We don't want motorists to be involved in accidents that are deadly or injurious either. So we see this as having tremendous potential. We are just a bit concerned about this unharnessed potential, this space that we're in right now, where there's a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, not enough understanding, quite frankly, not enough modeling yet done. We know that there have been a lot of pilots, and those pilots, some of those have not worked out optimally, and they're still being tested. We are concerned about there being human collateral in these tests. So we are just monitoring this very quickly, but again, accepting and embracing the promise of this. If we can ensure that we are better using our street space for pedestrians, if we are making sure that we, because we're moving vehicles more efficiently, are not expanding our roadways, if we are not introducing more vehicles that have more errant driver behavior onto the roadway, that is a benefit for the Vision Zero Network and for all of us as road users. When you're reducing cars on the street, you're naturally reducing the potential conflict, and that conflict creates a dangerous situation for any of us who are using that, the street space. We also think about it though from not just our road network, but designing communities that are safe and healthy and equitable for all of us. And what we've seen over the past 60, 70 years in this country is an emphasis on road building and road expansion. And that contributes to unhealthy communities and unhealthy people, quite frankly. So we are excited about being able to maximize a vehicle lane more efficiently because cars and vehicles and freight are traveling more closely together. From a transit perspective, we at the NTA have not yet fully implemented communications-based train control, CBTC. The promise of that is it allows trains to travel closer together and then maximizes the number of passengers and the frequency, and is moving people through the system a lot faster. We're excited about that technology, and seeing an analogous example on our streets delivers a lot of the same benefits. So there's so many different parallels between the transit sector, again, and the public space sector, the pedestrian, Vision Zero network space more broadly. So as I said at the beginning of my comments, we embrace this promise. We just want to make sure that all the stakeholders are involved, much like in any other sector, any part of this conversation. Are we including transportation officials? Yeah, that's usually the first check, right? But are we talking to public health individuals? Are we talking to urban and land use planners? Are we ensuring that we're getting the data that is needed? And what we've seen thus far is this has been a contentious discussion. We haven't always received the data that we wanted from all of these sectors to make the most informed decisions. So those are the sorts of things that we want to better understand in order for us to make better judgments on the safety benefits that are derived.
Thank you. You raised a lot of really good points and a lot of topics and kind of checklists that are universal to every city in the country right now. But like in many other areas, New York feels special in terms of autonomous vehicles. And so, Henry, I'm hoping you can talk about what is unique about developing autonomous vehicles for New York City as compared to other cities in this country and abroad.
Sure, that's a great question. So as a New Yorker, I'm allowed to say certain things about my own city. So I just wanted to put that out there first. Obviously, the sheer number of pedestrians and cyclists make New York different from any other city. And that's precisely the reason why Cruise and other companies want to test their vehicles, their technology here. And the thinking is that if you can prove your technology here, you can take it, replicate it, and have success in other places because it's so difficult here. And part of that is the New York mind state, our attitude, the fact that we jaywalk, we walk in the middle of the street. Our behavior can sometimes be unpredictable. But what we find is when we train our vehicles, for example, in the complex city that is San Francisco, when we train our vehicles, we are finding that they're responsive. But it's not just the attitudes of New Yorkers that's difficult. Quite frankly, it's the fact that a lot of our lawmakers, our policymakers, and staff, they're just not educated on AV issues, how the technology works, what are some of the benefits, where the technology is, and what are the capabilities where we are right now. That makes it difficult, certainly. But there are many sort of challenges with New York. One of the things that would be difficult for our company to launch today is the fact that New York doesn't have a very robust electric vehicle infrastructure. And since we are 100% green fleet, if we wanted to launch tomorrow in New York, that just would not be possible. So there are many things that need to happen. I think it needs to happen on both the city and the state levels. But you also need other very important stakeholders at the table as well in New York. I would say it's a very complex environment, and there are a number of issues, and congestion is one of them.
And thank you. And one other issue that really feels special to New York is the sheer number of professional drivers that we have here in this city in terms of taxi, Uber, Lyft, via all of the drivers that we see around the city. There's a pretty big question of what their future is after their driving services are no longer needed. So, Dawn, I'd like to pose to you how professional drivers in the taxi or hire vehicle industry might be affected and might how their paths might shift after the introduction of autonomous vehicles.
Thank you. So yeah, the industry transition, we expect it will be very difficult. I think the clearest benefits from kind of the people who work in this industry side will go to the largest players who've been investing in the technology, in some cases developing the technology, and have the capital and economies of scale to roll it out first and eliminate one of their biggest expenses, which is the cost of paying human drivers to deliver the trips. But there will also be losers on sort of the, or likely to be losers on the business side as well. There are over 900 mom and pop car services in New York City, many of which do not have the capital to probably come out the gate with these, and so they will probably face a competitive disadvantage as AVs roll out. And in New York City, I'm not sure how much about this is from here, but taxis aren't operated by several large companies. The vast majority of them are individually operated or owned in very small fleets. So they're similarly, at least unless the industry structure changes tremendously, they also, I think, are likely to struggle from a lack of the capital and economies of scale that we see from the ride-hailing companies. And then to the drivers, it's a huge concern. There are 190,000 people who earn their living or driving other people around in New York City, and that's not even getting into how many are employed in other forms of delivery service and other driving jobs. And the drivers we license are, I don't remember the exact figure, but it's over 95% immigrants to this country. On average, they have lower educational attainment. Many have limited English proficiency, so it's not a group that necessarily today has tremendous alternative job options that offer them what they're able to get from driving. So it's a big challenge. I think one bright side is because all of them have a relationship with us as their regulator. We have access to them to communicate with them and let them know what opportunities are out there, a little bit of which we do now, making them available, aware of different programs the city and nonprofits have to offer of all sorts. But it's really something that is going to require investment and coordination from a lot of levels of government. Certainly outside of my small regulatory agency and the city's workforce development, but the state and the federal government. And I was very pleased to hear from one of my colleagues last week that the federal government has, in their recent publications, acknowledged that workforce development and transition has to be a big part of this rollout. And so I'm hopeful that this planning ahead really happens so that we don't have, some of the sad situations that we've seen in other areas where there's been a tremendous industry change that has put a lot of people out of work.
Thank you. Now I want to bring our attention to another kind of specialized group of users, and those are people who require accessibility services. We're seeing a lot of kind of ride-hailing experimentation around the country where these services assist in paratransit service needs, and it's likely to grow in coming years because of the on-demand nature of the services and the and greater efficiencies in certain areas of these services. So Veronica, something that you've been thinking about a lot is paratransit, the future of paratransit. And how do you see the impact of autonomous vehicles playing out in services for people who may need extra assistance entering a vehicle or getting around?
If you've been paying attention, you know that 23% of our subway system is accessible, and that is insufficient. It is actually not even comparable to our sister systems in other cities in terms of age and scope and size, though the MTA doors is so significantly larger than those systems and many magnitudes, it's a hard comparison. But I do see there being a significant amount of promise in this particular area. So many of you might know that the MTA has embarked on a one-year pilot program for Access-a-Ride through eHail. And it has been an incredibly successful program. The pilot was opened only to about 1,200 users. There's a 150,000 Access-a-Ride users. So a very, very small segment of our Access-a-Ride customer base. It has been incredibly popular for the reasons that we would imagine. It is finally giving control to the user, to the customer, over their trip. They're able to open an app on their phone, those who are involved in the pilot program, again, that subset of 1,200, and request an accessible vehicle, much like many of us have been doing with the ride-sharing economy already. The challenge that we have is really a financial challenge and a bit of a capacity challenge at the moment, but during this pilot program, the MTA has not budgeted enough, but the board continues to approve expansions of these projects because we do want to see this e-hail project continue. But we have not yet budgeted enough for a phase 2. We have to understand what a phase 2 of this pilot program would look like. Nevertheless, there's significant potential here to deliver improved service. With only 23% of our subway stations accessible, we're not going to see enough short-term remedies for those of our customers that need escalators and elevators. And it's not just people in wheelchairs, we know that. If you break a leg, you need an escalator and elevator. If you have a cane, you might need that. So it's not just someone who is permanently impaired. It is any one of us that might need that service. So I see this as being something I'm very proud that the MTA has embarked upon. It is actually just like some of its other agencies across the country, sister agencies across the country, at the very beginning of this, a lot of these agencies have not yet fully integrated a model for e-hail, and they're all looking at it, so at least there's some peer exchange and information sharing happening. But I do see this as being a shorter term solution than making all 472 subway stations accessible. That is going to take quite some time. And even though it has been made a priority in the Fast Forward program, Andy Byford's program, or colloquially known, is going to take quite a bit of time. So harnessing this potential of e-hail and ride sharing for this customer base is important. We just have to develop what a good model looks like, and quite frankly, what a sustainable funding model looks like.
Thank you. So we've touched on so many different aspects of ride-hailing and shared rides this afternoon, and I will turn it over to audience Q&A momentarily because I'm sure there are plenty of questions from all of you. But before we do that, I'd like some closing thoughts from the three of you on what is the AV outlook for shared rides and ride-hail in New York City, and what are the, no pun intended, bumps in the road on the way to get there? And in general, do you have a utopian or dystopian view of where we're going? Dawn, I'll start with you.
Thank you. So overall outlook, and hopefully no one's recording this and then we'll replay it in 10 years and show how wrong we were about all of this. You know,
technology summit done.
Yeah, all right, so email me in 10 years or whatever we're doing in 10 years. Let me know what I said. So I think AV adoption in New York City might take longer than some people think. And I think, you know, Henry's someone in the industry who I think really understands like the complexity of the city itself and our stakeholder process and the fact that I think we have high expectations for what we expect from companies who wish to do business in our public spaces. But I think for all those reasons, it might take longer here than in other places, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think there might be some more challenges than expected and maybe of different sorts, some we haven't thought of yet, but I do think that human drivers do more than maybe we recognize on a typical trip. Maybe you're just happy if he's quiet and you're quiet, but on a lot of trips, they actually play an important role. You know, whether it's, you know, for a little extra tip bringing your IKEA furniture in the house, or I've had them help me keep my kid from running in the street while I open up a stroller, to various types of assisting people with various special needs. You know, I think it's one thing to have wheelchair ramps in vehicles, and you know, that's a good step, but there are lots of other sorts of special needs of people with visual impairments, audio impairments, cognitive impairments, and human drivers are able to often assist all those types of people. So I think the companies really need to think about how do we serve people with a wide variety of abilities and a wide variety of ages. You know, I am, I think, overall an optimist. I think that, you know, our culture will figure out how to function with these. Our regulatory environment will figure out what we need to do, but I guess my hope is that the transition between the vehicles being in place and us figuring out culturally and kind of regulatorily how to address the challenges associated with them, the transition isn't too painful. And one thing I've seen, I've been at the Tax and Limousine Commission since 2010, and I've seen the transition to having ride-hailing vehicles. And I feel that we've been able to address a lot of the challenges they've presented to the city relatively quickly because as a city agency, we're able to make rules relatively quickly. And so I think having the right kind of governance at the right levels of government and having people who understand it and are, you know, willing to stand up to the companies when they need to and collaborate with them when they should is really important. And I guess the other thing is we have to continue the workforce conversation and get really serious about the investments that we'll need to make, or there will be a tremendous human fallout to this transition.
That's going to be tough to follow up. This is a difficult question for me to answer because I'm the one sort of working on this every day. What I can tell you is that we in GM, we are committed to coming to New York. We want to test in New York. We think our technology could benefit from all the learnings from New Yorkers, but it is really complex. And so we're continuing to do this work, work that's just never been done before. We're having conversations that have never happened before. And we're optimistic that when the time is right, we will be able to come in and test. It is really, really difficult to give sort of a timeline on that. But for us, the drivers are really safety. We're really trying to put this technology out there that can save lives, and that is what you'll find the majority of the people who work at our company, and that's why they do this. There are a multitude of benefits that we would love to bring to New York ultimately, but a lot needs to happen beforehand. There is currently a pilot program on the books. However, there's other legislation that needs to be passed before any kind of final deployment would be possible. So work needs to happen at both the city level from a policy perspective and at the state level from a regulatory perspective.
We have to keep humans at the center of this opportunity. This has to be a human-centered development. This cannot be an auto industry-centered development. And we, quite frankly, can't put all of our confidence or faith or trust in this industry. And no slight to Henry and GM or any other automobile manufacturer, but history tells us the auto industry has not been on the front lines of safety unless they've been forced to implement safety regulations. And that's not to say there's not an opportunity for a new era, and we're seeing that, and we're seeing that conscientiousness built into this new era from a lot of manufacturers. So, you know, I want to be honest about that, but we need to be honest too that we can't rely on the auto industry to drive this conversation. We need to make sure that as we implement these technologies, people remain at the center. How they move about, how they not just use the streetscape, how they just not use our bicycle lanes, but how much land is being devoted to this? What kind of green spaces are we developing and preserving and creating and supporting because we're not building additional vehicle lane miles in this country anymore? What kinds of communities are we supporting that are healthy and equitable and enabling people of all different abilities to move around. And that is not just going to come from one stakeholder group, and not to single out auto industry. It's not going to come just from the transportation advocacy community. It has to come from these shared stakeholders, and we've all expressed that opinion, that it has to be a variety of stakeholders at the table. So as we're moving forward, we can't just start from one sector. We need to start all the sectors together, developing this moving forward. That's the value of conversations like this. These sorts of technology summits and convenings is bringing all of us as stakeholders together from the onset, not as an afterthought, not as, oh, we forgot to invite our law enforcement to talk about how we're designing our streets. Later when it presents a challenge to, a Vision Zero improvement for example. So just lastly, again, I want to reiterate, keeping people at the center of these developments and this technology.
Thank you. There are a lot of important takeaways here, especially the idea of having all the stakeholders at the table from the outset, and I think that's what we're starting to do here, and hopefully we'll broaden the tent later on. I do want to bring into audience Q&A, but first a message that tomorrow, if you're interested in transportation technologies, I highly encourage you to return to this room tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. for the Transportation Startup Showcase, where we will have 10 startups presenting their innovations across the industry for every mode, including autonomous vehicles. And it'll be a really good event. So it'll be here, doors open at 2:30. Now I'd like to open it up to audience questions. Does anyone, Kamel?
Sure, thanks Sarah. Thanks for this dialogue. I love the topic, I love the conversation, particularly my last piece. Veronica, you spoke about people, and a city of 8.5 million, who do you concentrate on? Is it the loudest squeaky wheel, or whom do you mean when you say people? But really, Dawn, you hit up on some great points about the changes that we've seen happening in the shared industry, particularly as of late. I wonder, would we not be in a state now with an exiting mayor? Would the amazing rules that we just passed happen, where there's such a political struggle to tell an industry, we're going to curb your access, we're going to regulate you further. So the question really is, at what point does government step in and say, we've learned from the MTA and others that when we don't create fully accessible environments, we'll never be successful. The only guaranteed way to fail is by not providing for your most vulnerable user, because you'll always be in a perpetual retrofit state. So where do you as government step in and tell an AV industry, you're not providing for my most vulnerable user, and until you get there, you're not invited to play in the New York environment. And that's what I see happening here. No AV company is talking about the most vulnerable user. They're not just talking about persons with disabilities, which we know is 11% of the population in New York, but there are 130,000 births, as you know. That's a stroller, which today a CAV helps a mom or a dad with that baggage, put a stroller in the back. How does that play out in an autonomous environment?
I think starting again, having started the TLC in 2010, when we had, I think accessible vehicles were in the single digits. I think through a lot of real challenging instances of litigation and painful rulemaking processes, we've made a lot of progress on accessibility. And I think the results of that we're seeing already in the yellow taxi industry, which has had accessibility requirements for longer and is now part of the MTA pilot, and so it's kind of cross-pollinating access and at the transit price point for people who need transportation. And I can't afford to take for hire everywhere I go, so it needs to be accessible to people who are paying the transit fare. Starting this January, all of the for hire vehicle companies, so that includes Uber and Lyft, who we could probably predict will be some of the biggest AV companies, they are going to have accessibility requirements that are pretty serious. And what I think it makes them so serious is that we're requiring the data to actually be able to monitor the level of service that people with disabilities are able to access. There was a much weaker rule on the book for many years, but without the data, how could you enforce it? So I'm optimistic that in the fields we regulate, it's going to get a lot better, because if it's not, we're going to see it pretty quickly and have to kind of take steps to push the industry there. And in terms of autonomous vehicles, I can't see us rolling back any of those requirements once the vehicles are autonomous. I think the bigger question that I guess I don't have the answer to is does it push them farther, or do they stay at the same levels they are if it's a level of service that's acceptable to us as a city? Does that answer your question?
It showcases the difficulty question.
Just to offer some perspective on Cruise, so you won't hear about a lot of our work in the news just because of the proprietary nature of what we do. But I just got back from San Francisco and I saw the results of our accessibility study. And it's just part one of a study we did over the last couple of months, where we did interviews, surveys, and ride-alongs for people with disabilities. We had folks who are blind, visually impaired, deaf, hard of hearing, and those who are wheelchair bound. And they came in, they helped us with our design process. They showed us some of the things we got right, some of the things we didn't get right. The results of that work will be seen in the commercially available product. I don't know what that's going to look like. We announced earlier this month a $2.75 billion partnership with Honda, and what that allows us to do is to collaborate on another vehicle that potentially would be ADA compliant. And I say potentially because I'm not making any announcements here, but just to give you the sense that this work is happening every day, and our company isn't the only company that's looking at that right now.
The regulatory framework should have a role, but it'd be nice if we don't always have to use that as a stick to get things moving in a progressive manner. So with regards to accessibility in our subway network, the accessibility we have now is a result of a federal mandate. And while now the NTA is doing a study or conducting a study of 150 stations to determine the level of accessibility and the options for that. And that did not come about as a result of regulation, but it did come about as a result of advocacy. So it would be great to get to a point where we're working with companies that are proactively thinking about this without using regulation as that tool, that stick, because it would be nice to enter a new era, a new phase where we're seeing this partnership, right? And that partnership comes from, at the onset, saying this is how we want to contribute, this is how we want to do something differently, even if it impacts our bottom line from a revenue perspective. And if not, it's nice to know that you have a regulatory framework as that lever to push when necessary. But it would be great to not always start there or not force that change, and instead start from this collaborative model of identifying some of the challenges that you've pointed out and working towards solutions together, not sort of developing a solution in response to an allegation or a claim of inequity or inaccessibility or any number of other claims that can be made.
And just one, I agree completely, and I think that maybe the work that Henry's company is doing is demonstration of hopefully getting ahead of it and being proactive in providing the access that they should as a company. But it just has been our experience that
None of the companies we regulate has provided meaningful accessible service voluntarily. It came about either because accessibility advocates sued the city to impose those regulations, and then later under the current administration, we proactively decided to impose those regulations, and the industry, Uber, all of them sued us over those. The city was successful, but I think it speaks to hopefully we enter a new day, but if we don't, we need those. We need agile and fearless regulators in place to be able to bring about the changes that we want for the general public.
Okay. Thanks. It looks like we have a lot of audience questions, so I'm going to do a rainbow across the room. So let's start.
Hey, how's it going? Hey, Veronica. My question is about governance, and I guess particularly for Rudin and Dawn, because you're involved in that and answer as well. You mentioned that people in the transit space have viewed taxis as kind of an extension of transit. Now we're also seeing some of the opposite with the paratransit pilot. Do you think that the current regulatory framework is the one that might make sense, having the TLC and the Transit Operating Agency separate? And obviously there's a lot of legacy here in New York with that, and it's much more difficult. But to maybe another city or even a suburb that might not have that entrenched regulatory framework, what would be your thoughts on how to integrate transit versus taxi regulation versus even looking at streets and public works or DOT? And for Henry, I guess when you're dealing with cities, you don't need to pick any in particular out, but what governance methods make it better or worse for you to deal with?
This one is really simple for me. So I'm not going to name the city, but one city in particular, they showed up with everyone around the table, but everyone there's ongoing communication, discussion, meetings. Everyone is always at the table, if you will. There are some markets you go into and it's not okay to speak with this agency versus that agency. In City X, everyone is working together, and there are challenges. But finding that everyone's being a team player and offering their perspective and willing to sort of be out there and not always be right, we are finding that's a very good approach. It's hard to sort of replicate that in New York just because of so many there's institutional histories that sort of cloud that and prevent that from happening. But that is sort of the best regulatory environment where you have everyone at the table for one-stop shopping and you all work the problem together.
We really need to rethink the infrastructure that exists around collaboration. So, to give a pretty head-scratching example, New York City DOT and MTA didn't really start working together really well on buses and buses on New York City streets until about 2007, when a year later in 2008, the city's first select bus service route launched in the Bronx. And that was sort of the beginning of these two divisions and two of the most important transportation agencies in the entire state and arguably, the country really started working together. There has been very good partnership between MTA and TLC on the e-hail discussion and e-hail advocacy, right? But there's not, the infrastructure even on the agency side is still developing. And I think there's some really good people who have been very intentional about a collaborative model and talking about who needs to be around the table. But it's not always the first inclination and the first invite at the meeting. So I think we, New York in particular, have a lot to learn from other cities in this regard who are more nimble than New York City is, less bureaucratic and less regulated, that have more flexibility and more freedom to do a little bit more innovative collaboration. New York City, as we all know, doesn't do it well all the time. There's a lot to be learned from models set by other cities on how they've approached some of these challenges. So, Alec, I know it's not the best answer, but it's really more to acknowledge that we need a new infrastructure around this. As you know, we're talking about this, all these emergent technologies. We also need an emergent infrastructure base, actually. And I don't mean infrastructure in the sense all of us think, right? I think in terms of systems and design for collaboration and partnership that really haven't existed particularly well. And but the positive side of that is there's a lot of good intention and will around wanting to do this better. I'm seeing it amongst many different agencies, and not just within the transportation sector. I'm seeing it in other fields and other sectors too, and I find that incredibly encouraging. But I think we have a lot to learn from other cities. So, you know, what you can share with me, Alec, let me know. So in my Vision Zero Network role, I can help spread it around.
I just have a small addition. I don't have particular expertise in kind of like city transportation governance, but you know, I think there's something attractive about the London model where it's far more under one house. I think they've achieved a lot, and I've heard that a lot of that is attributable to having everything under one house. So I think if I were like a casual observer, I might say, yeah, everything should be together. But having worked at the TLC for a long time, you know, my concern would be, you know, that this area that's really important in New York City and we're very rapidly changing, if it were part of a larger agency that had many other equally or more meritorious issues on leadership's plate, that it might not have gotten the attention it needs. So I think that's just the flip side of coordination is attention. And I think what's been good is that there, you know, of late, you know, there has been like good collaboration with the MTA. Sometimes in New York, it's a small transportation town, and you know, Commissioners Zoshi from TLC and Trottenberg from DOT are like very good supporters and collaborators with each other, and that has really flowed down to our staff. So I feel like at least between those two agencies, the silo problem is not as great as it could be because of the leadership and staff level collaboration is just extremely strong in this administration.
That's the best argument I've heard for government fragmentation in New York City in a long time. The gentleman in the hat.
Yes, thanks a lot. I'm a full-time pedestrian, and I really appreciate Veronica's mention that it's all human. I believe that New York City, with 8.5 million people, the pedestrian rules, or should rule. There's been a lot of great stuff today about transportation and the nexus between people, business. I also like the idea that we're thinking outside the box a lot, but we also have to investigate what's inside the box that's not being looked at, the elephant. So I want to bring up a subject that, my question is, how does this subject that I'm going to bring up affect the parameters of your design methods? And that is climate change, global warming. The UN just predicted that the change is happening much faster, and the tipping point is approaching much faster. So we know from Sandy that if all the subways are flooded, if all of Lower Manhattan and the coastline of Brooklyn and Queens is flooded, where the cars are automated or human, it's not going to work. Maybe the only way of transportation will be the elevator, if it's more than. So, has that factor ever come up in your design and your program parameters to take into account these things? Because basically whistling in the wind if we're not taking into that account.
I'm going to ask just one of you to field this in the interest of time, because I think there are a few other audience questions. So do we have a volunteer?
I thought, is it addressed to Henry?
No,
it's just
the process?
So for us, especially when we think about New York City, we recognize New York City has a $20 billion sustainability and resiliency program. There are aggressive goals at both the city and the state levels to reduce greenhouse gas emission. And so that's why, although we are a General Motors company, we are not using gas-powered vehicles for our cars. We don't test with gas-powered vehicles. We're not going to be launching any gas-powered vehicles. In fact, GM has promised to deliver over 20 electric vehicles by 2023. So we're really investing in electric vehicles as a cleaner form of the car. And that's part of our strategy and what makes us competitive. There are other autonomous vehicle companies who don't invest in EV infrastructure.
That was not my question. The question was, if the ocean rises, what happens?
So
Or when the ocean rises?
I think your question is really good for this reason. It touches on something that I said earlier about the amount of land that we're devoting to vehicles, the amount of land that we're devoting to other things. We know that impervious surfaces are the worst sorts of surfaces to deal with these storm surges, right? We know that impermeable surfaces are not good for our communities, they're not good for our coastlines, they're not good for communities on the coastlines. So while it's important that we've now moved into an era where we're talking about cleaner vehicles, right? But if we're having more of these vehicles of any type, even if they're cleaner, demanding more land, then we are reducing our green space and we're back into this cycle, this loop of designing around the vehicle. And I think that is a very important consideration, not just for transportation, but land use planning and housing development and park space. Again, going back to this multi-stakeholder conversation. So, you know, it is a different question than most people would ask, but climate change is the UN, as you know, sir, I'm sure, in its development goals, identify transportation, right? And we need to start thinking about transportation very differently on a worldwide scale. In New York, the transportation sector is the second largest emitter of GHG, right? In other states, such as Connecticut, it's #1. So, you know, it does require an all-encompassing approach to how we're designating our land, but thinking through it of this environmental climate change lens. We need to start thinking about different types of surfaces, and again, going back to some of the details and the minutiae of what many of us were saying, you know, but from the Vision Zero Network, designing communities that are healthy. It's not just about pedestrian safety or bicyclist safety, it's healthy, safe, and equitable communities as well. And factoring in climate change is part of that.
Thanks, that was a great response. Yes.
This is for Henry specifically, so hopefully not a long time question. You noted that even if Cruise is ready to deploy tomorrow, that there's a lack of available EV infrastructure in the city. So what would a city look like that is ready to accept these EVs, and how is Cruise considering these vehicles will get charged, especially if there's no driver?
I'm sorry, say the last part again?
Who's going to charge these if no one's driving them?
So yeah, and that's the great part about being in the design phase. We are actively looking at different solutions. There are all types of companies out there that can provide different charging needs. So that's at most what I can say about that. And I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question again?
What would the city look like if it was ready to accept these vehicles in terms of EV infrastructure?
Another good question. So Cruise is at the table for a lot of these discussions. I would say the state is a little bit more ahead, although I have to give credit for Mayor de Blasio, who was really gone sort of further than any other mayor in terms of EV infrastructure in New York. Really because of New York is so complicated, it's hard to figure out what it could look like. We have to look at what the city is doing. The city has its own charging stations, but many of them aren't L2 chargers. But what it really comes down to is the actual technology. And so what you have now is a lot of the EV stakeholders Con Ed, and they're working with NYSERDA, New York Power Authority, the Utility Commission, all trying to come up with different ways of looking at this problem. In cities that we've addressed this issue, what I would say is that there's underutilized land. And so in many cases, the city will have access to land where they'll want to lease it to private companies like Cruise for EV infrastructure. New York is a little bit different in that way, so there has to be some real innovation.
I'd like to thank our panel. That's all we have time for this afternoon. Thank you for your words of wisdom pertaining to ride-hail and ride-share here in New York City. That was really powerful. A lot of important messaging here. And thank you to all of you for participating and for your fantastic questions to the panelists. We'll see you here tomorrow morning.
And just before we get to the panel, one last round of applause. I will make a plug based on that question for tomorrow morning, because one of our sessions is about the future of land use and urban development with regards to AV adoption. So we have full morning tomorrow starting 9 a.m. here in this room. We'll be going till 1, there'll be lunch, and then the startup showcase that Sarah said will begin at 2:30. So hope to see all of you tomorrow as well. And thanks to the panel again.